About the 25th principle of liberty, which is another one of those quotes from, who said this? Thomas Jefferson. When he said, what? In his first inaugural address, peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. In other words, we should be what? To everybody. Friendly. Right? Extend a hand of friendship. They may not take it, they may not shake it, but at least we extend the hand of friendship. Political connections, none. With none. And what great wisdom that is, and we're going to talk about this today, about the policies that have led us through the first part of our existence as a nation and then through the latter part and the difference. First of all, if sometimes today, well, let me back up and say this. The founders actually called this position separatism. Separatism, which means, as we've said, you remain friendly but politically separate. So there is a separatist kind of feeling there. You're not tied to them. Today, people who sometimes we talk to and are not of that opinion would say, well then, you are what? Now they use another word. Did you get that? They use the word isolationist. Oh, you're an isolationist. What's the difference? A person who isolates himself doesn't even want to talk to somebody, right? Founders were not that way. They were not isolationists. They wanted to be friendly with everybody. Why did they want to be friendly with everybody? Because the goal of the United States is to be, 28th principle, what? An example to the entire world. You can't be an example if you isolate yourself. So the people who make these accusations of isolationism are wrong. It's not what we're talking about. We're talking about being separate politically, but being friendly. And one nation that really was an example through many years is what? Of the founders' philosophy is Switzerland. Switzerland, which has remained politically neutral through all the thick and thin of war of Europe. I want you to tell me, what countries surround Switzerland? Remember this from your geography? You've got Austria, you got Germany, south of Germany, next to Switzerland is France. Down on the bottom of Switzerland, Switzerland goes into, you come off the Alps, you go into Italy. Very good. All of those nations have been involved in war, in many wars, have they not? And Switzerland is just there saying, no thanks. We're going to stay out of this. Really kind of amazing. And so countries and people come there to do what? To buy, sell, and bank. Nice, safe place, right in the middle of everything. Because they have not been involved in all these wars. That may be changing a little bit now because of some of the recent votes. But Switzerland is a great example of this separatist policy. Come and be our friend. Oh, we want you to be our friend. Deposit your money with us. But don't ask us to get involved in your politics. Kind of an interesting position, isn't it? Very wise position. And it's the position that the United States followed for about the first 125 years as a nation. Now, probably the foremost proponent of this position was George Washington. We're going to read today from his counsel to the nation as he left the presidency. This is his farewell address. And you just got to appreciate the fact that Washington had had a lot of experience both during the war and as president. And he had some counsel that he wanted to leave with the people of the United States. And he felt so strongly about foreign policy because it was beginning to happen in his day. What should be our foreign policy? Should we make treaty after treaty and alliances with foreign nations? He had great wisdom as he explained to the American people his counsel in his farewell address. I want you to go to bottom page 268 as we read some of this. He says, observe faith and justice toward all nations. Cultivate peace and harmony with all. Religion and morality enjoin this conduct. What does that mean? Enjoin this conduct. Religion and morality, what? Yeah, it's expected of someone who's religious and moral. Religion and morality encourages it, doesn't it? Doesn't it? Be friendly with everybody. Love your enemies. Do good to them that despitefully use you. That's what he's saying here. And can it be that good policy does not equally enjoin it? In other words, if religion and morality suggest that that's what we ought to do, that's what our policy really ought to do. Good policy would enjoin it. It will be worthy of a free, enlightened, and at no distant period. That's an interesting observation, because it won't be very long before the United States becomes a very powerful nation. And he says it, at no distant period. A great nation to give to mankind the magnanimous and too novel example of a people always guided by an exalted justice and benevolence. Do you see that vision there that he expected America to go to? America would be the most powerful nation in the world, but her example to the rest of the world would be one of exalted justice and benevolence. Being friendly and helpful to everybody. Do you think the nations of the world would respond? The people of the world would respond? Yes, that's what his vision was. So he goes on and he says, we're at the top page 269, in the execution of such a plan, nothing is more essential than that permanent, inveterate antipathies against particular nations and passionate attachments for others should be excluded, and that in place of them just and amicable feelings toward all should be cultivated. What's he saying? Avoid what? Avoid feeling what? How does he say it? Antipathies against particular nations. Developing dislike, even hatred for particular nations, and passionate attachments to others. Let me ask you, is that kind of a natural thing to develop dislike for some people and a liking to others? See, that's kind of a natural tendency, but both religion and morality says what? You should really try to what? Be friendly to everyone. You never know when the person you disliked may become what? Your best friend or your boss. At least your best friend. Have you ever noticed that? Have you had that experience yet in life? Somebody you just really wondered about at the beginning, and if you had drawn a judgment, you'd have been wrong. Because later, with more experiences, you got to know that person, you thought, you know, that guy's all right. That's what Washington's saying here. He says, the nation which indulges toward another and habitual hatred or an habitual fondness is in some degree a slave. It is a slave to its animosity or to its affection, either of which is sufficient to lead it astray from its duty and its and its interest. So, cultivate peace and harmony. And he's, you know, it's a natural tendency to want to do this, but we must resist, because if you have what he calls habitual hatred or dislike for somebody, or a habitual fondness, he says you can become a slave to that. What is he talking about? Somehow that will hold you in bondage, just that desire to like or dislike. And perhaps it won't reflect the real you, or at least the way you should really be. It's just because, well, he's my friend, so, you know, I'm going to kind of overlook some things, and when maybe you shouldn't. I want to suggest maybe this very same concept on a very personal level about attaching yourself too soon to somebody and saying, oh, he's my boyfriend or she's my girlfriend. What might that do? Tell me. I know I'm treading on some thin ice here, but I really think Washington's advice as nations applies to individuals too. Don't attach yourself so readily to somebody, because as soon as you do, what are you telling everybody else? Either stay away or I don't like you as well as I like you. Do you really want to give that off right now? Why not show a likeness to everybody? Of course, you're always going to have some of those that you'd rather be with than others. That's okay. But when you say, I'm going with that person, isn't that what you say now? You're going with somebody? That says to everybody else what? Yeah, hands off. Not allowed to go there. And I'm just suggesting that at your age, in high school, that's probably premature to be so attached to one person. Because you've seen it as I've seen it. It doesn't last in most cases. Something will happen, some change will happen. Maybe he'll do something you don't like, or she'll do something you don't like, and all of a sudden, well, I didn't know he was that way. I didn't know she was that way. And you just kind of grow apart. And, am I making sense here, folks? Play the field. Have you heard this before from your parents? Play the field. Don't become so attached to one person. It's not that time yet. I don't know. I think it makes a lot of sense here what Washington is saying. You've had that conversation? Habitual hatred is slavery. And it's easier to insult. These are the things that Washington said. Let's even take this a little farther. On the bottom of page 269, he talks about the problem with playing favorites. Do you ever play favorites? Does it cause any problems? Let's see what Washington says it causes problems among nations. This is bottom of 269. This is still his farewell address. He says, so likewise a passionate attachment of one nation for another produces a variety of evils. Sympathy for the favorite nation facilitating the illusion of an imaginary common interest in cases where no real common interest exists, and infusing into one the enmities of the other, betrays the former into a participation in the quarrels and wars of the latter without adequate inducement or justification. Let me stop there and ask you if you agree with that. You say, yeah, on a national level, but do you agree with that on a personal level? You attach yourself too much to one person. That person's battles become your battles, whether you want them to or not. Because that person is, you're going with that person, and you got to protect them, and you got, and even though they may not choose the right in an incident or so, it's so easy to overlook because you're going with them. Do you see what Washington is saying? Your thinking can be skewed here. And I think it's kind of interesting. It leads, he says, also to concessions to the favorite nation of privileges denied to others. You're attached too closely to someone personally, you might give concessions where you otherwise wouldn't. Do you understand what I'm saying? See, there's some agreement out there. And Washington is saying, play the field as a nation. I'm saying play the field as an individual. Same principles apply. Anyway, kind of interesting, his counsel to us. Well, let's see. He says, which is apt doubly to injure the nation making the concessions by unnecessarily parting with what ought to have been retained and exciting jealousy, ill will, and disposition to retaliate in the parties from whom equal privileges are withheld. And I'll just make this one last point about the personal thing and then get off of it. But you're going with somebody, everybody knows it, and so nobody asks you to go to the dance, or to, except for, that one person, and maybe he will, maybe he won't. Do you feel like you're a little bit trapped? You would. I'll guarantee you, if it lasts long enough, you kind of feel trapped. Hey, I kind of want to go. Well, I don't want to go. Oh, well, doggone it. I'd sure like to go.
Full happiness. That's
No.
totally how I am, right?
See, Stephen's relating to us here.
But I'm not going late.
Okay, all right. I'm telling you, it's the same principle and it applies. Well, anyway, little thought. He talks about playing favorites. It gives the illusion of a what? When you say, I'm going to be your friend no matter what, or I'm going to be your friend forever, whatever, it gives an illusion of what? Common interest. You may or may not have a common interest down the road, but it gives the illusion that you have common interest. And it leads to concessions to favored nations. You call somebody favored, what does that mean about everybody else? They're what? They're not so favored. Not sure you need to call them enemies, but they're not so favored. But they could start thinking that you don't like them. And this is a government term. This is used in State Department circles. Most favored nation status. And there are nations today, and we have this delineation. Favored nations and then most favored nations. Now, if you're a nation outside the United States and want to get in good favor with the United States, what list do you want to get on? Most favored nation. I mean, you get economic concessions. Some of your goods can pass more easily into the United States, into its markets. Maybe the tariffs might be a little lower. There's some real advantages to being on the most favored nation status. However, well, let's read Washington here, bottom of 270. He says, against the insidious wiles of foreign influence, I conjure you to believe me, fellow citizens. I think he's kind of pleading with us here. He knows what we're in for. The jealousy of a free people ought to be constantly awake, since history and experience prove that foreign influence is one of the most baneful foes of Republican government. But that jealousy, to be useful, must be impartial. What's he saying? You should express your concern impartially, not just to a few. Jealousy must be impartial, else it becomes the instrument of the very influence to be avoided instead of a defense against it. Excessive partiality for one foreign nation and excessive dislike for another cause those whom they actuate to see danger only on one side and serve to veil and even second the arts of influence on the other. Isn't that so true? Don't you seem to overlook the mistakes of your friends? Which is okay in many ways. It's fine. Overlook the mistakes of your friends. But when those you don't like or you dislike a little bit make mistakes, isn't there a tendency to kind of emphasize them, talk about them, point at them? When if they were your friends, you would just isn't that what he's saying here? It's exactly what he's saying. Oh, great advice. Look at the top of the next page. This might surprise you. Two that have been on the State Department's most favored nation list for a number of years now. Communist China and even Russia when it was part of the Soviet Union. Incredible. people who have and had philosophies that would want to bury the United States. Somehow we have said to them, well, we want to be your friends, and we'll give you concessions, even more so than people who don't have the philosophy to destroy America. This is amazing. Yeah, and that's why. If we're nice to them, maybe they'll mellow. Have you seen any mellowing lately? Anyway, and that's kind of an interesting thing. Well, the founder's advice then is what? Top of page 271. This is still Washington. He said, "The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is, in extending our commercial relations, to have with them as little political connections as possible." Commercial relations, yes. Political connections, no. And that's basically the gist of what Washington said our foreign policy should be. Look at the next paragraph. He actually explains this. And he gets pretty specific here. He says, "Europe has a set of primary interests which to us have none or a very remote relation." What is Europe's interest? Maybe we should say, what has been their interest over the centuries? Countries in Europe, as evidenced by their many wars. What do you think their interests are? Hopefully that's been mitigated a little bit in our day. But there is war after war after war. Either religious wars, gaining new territory, for whatever reason. They're always at each other's throat, or have been as far as history goes. And what is Washington saying? Their interests are not our interests. What is the interest of the United States? What is the goal of the United States? We've talked about this. Principle 28. To provide freedom, prosperity, and freedom for whom? For the whole world. To set an example for the whole world to follow. You find European nations doing that? I don't think so. You don't find it in their writings, in their official documents, like you do in the United States. What does the United States say? Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, right? You find Europe saying that? Give me your huddled masses. They're the ones that produce the huddled masses yearning to breathe free. They want to get out of there. At least they did in the founding era. Do you understand this? So Washington says that their interests are different than ours. Hence, she must be engaged in frequent controversies, the causes of which are essentially foreign to our concerns. Hence, therefore, it must be unwise in us to implicate ourselves by artificial ties in the ordinary combinations and collisions of her friendship or enmities. Why, by interweaving our destiny with that of any part of Europe, entangle our peace and prosperity in the toils of European ambition, rivalship, interests, humor, or caprice, asks Washington. So we think we do a great thing, for example, in forming a political alliance with some of the nations of Western Europe, which we call NATO. You've heard of NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which basically says what? To those little nations, we're forming an alliance with you. If you're attacked, we will come to your aid. It basically says if any nation is attacked, all the rest of the nations will come to the aid. But if the United States is a party to the contract, who's the one that's really going to provide the aid? The United States. So if you're a little nation in Europe, would it be to your benefit to sign on to that treaty? Absolutely. What does that mean you don't have to have? Much of a military. Because if we're attacked, the United States is going to come help us. Do you see that connection there? Washington says be very careful of that. Because even the littlest of nation that you have a political connection with, if it does something and gets itself into trouble, if you have a political agreement, a treaty with them, what are you obligated to do? Their enemies become your enemies just because you've signed a treaty. And it'll draw you right in there. Has that happened? Oh yes. Oh yes. I'm telling you, the founder's wisdom is so incredibly powerful when you think about it. Europe has different interests. There's frequent controversies. They have different beliefs. They have a different idea of their destiny, what they're all about, what their goals are, their ambitions. So Washington's advice is be friends with them, but let no political connections happen. I want you to turn over to 272. And it's kind of interesting, even in his day, there were political connections. Did he advise breaking them off immediately? No. On the top of 272 is a quote. Go down 4 lines. This is still his farewell address. He says, I repeat it, therefore let those engagements be observed in their genuine sense, the ones that then existed. But in my opinion, it is unnecessary and would be unwise to extend them. Let them die their own death. When time runs out, don't extend them. See, that's being honorable, isn't it? Okay. Now look at the